Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few, US PI's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers. In each episode, Sherry delivers the latest news from the front lines of the fight for the minds of the next generation, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few, and I have another great show for you. Joining me today is Jeff Tuomala, a legal scholar dedicated to restoring the moral foundations of law through teaching and legal consulting worldwide. And we're going to discuss why tax-funded education is an unconstitutional establishment of religion in violation of the First Amendment. But before I bring him on, please give us a 5-star rating and subscribe to the show. And be sure to visit uspie.org to learn more and to join the movement.
Today's episode is brought to you by U.S. parents involved in education. U.S. PI's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from U.S. parents involved in education, connect with us at US PI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. My guest today is Jeff Tuomala, a distinguished legal scholar and retired U.S. Marine Corps Reserve Colonel. He has taught at both Liberty University and Regent University law schools, specializing in international law, human rights, and armed conflict. As a judge advocate, he handled criminal prosecution, defense, and international law, teaching military officers worldwide. Jeff Tuomala, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Sherry.
Yes, I'm so thrilled that you were able to come on today. I'm very excited about this discussion. I'd like for you to tell our audience a bit about yourself and why you decided to tackle this topic.
Well, it started 42 years ago this month. I was at a conservative caucus convention that Howard Phillips had put on, and he invited a couple speakers, one in particular that I wanted to hear, who I was familiar with his writing, and that was Rushdoony. The other was Herb Titus, who became the founding dean at Regent Law School. I'd never heard of him before, but they both spoke on the topic of education. And what Rushdoony had kind of taught me in terms of theologically, Titus put it into the language of law. And for the first time, I heard not only was education outside the jurisdiction of the state, but our legal system, in terms of the way religion is defined and the principles in it, is that it's outside the jurisdiction of the state constitutionally. And so over the years, I didn't always teach constitutional law. I taught it for about the last 18 years when I was here at Liberty, working on that and other issues. And eventually, last spring, our student law review did a symposium on education. So I told them I would write an article. And so that was the immediate incentive to me to get it all into basically one document and put it out in a systematic form. But the real inspiration, insight that came from Herbert Titus.
That is so intriguing, but I have to tell you that I listened in preparation for this interview. I listened to another interview you did, and I'd love for you to share a little bit about your salvation experience and how you equated grace and the law and how that evolved. I just think that's such a spectacular story. Can you tell us a little bit about that as well?
I was in my last year of law school, and I'd finished my basic Marine Corps training, and my roommate was getting married. I was his best man, and one of the gifts he gave me was 4 parallel translations of the New Testament. And I started reading that, the book of John, and I'd read it in all 4 translations or versions. And it was in the course of reading that all of a sudden, Scripture took on meaning that it never had to me before. I think it was the Holy Spirit that made me hear things and see things I'd never heard before. Although I'd been raised in a church and, audibly heard those things. And I had a friend in law school who was a Christian, and I knew that. And we started having discussions and going to church together and things of that nature. Well, I went on active duty in the Marine Corps as a Christian, and I realized I didn't have any more sense of justice or what it was about, really, than anybody else that was there. And I had a sense that I wanted to be in full-time ministry. So what do? You go to seminary. And fortunately, I had an Old Testament professor who started Old Testament 1 with a syllabus that he had done, fairly detailed, on the relationship of law and grace. And in particular, what law can do, it has the ability to do, and what it cannot do. And law can establish a standard for behavior, a sanction. In some ways, it even incites sin. But two things it can't do: it can't provide a remedy for the wrong done, and it can't provide you with relief from that ongoing sin. And I realized somehow, I don't think he made this connection directly, but the law can't make us good. It can't provide a remedy for it. There's certain things the law cannot do. And translated that into what the state, obviously, with its law, it's powerless that way. And eventually I came to see, education is tied to that. One of the purposes of education is to, make us better. But the state is powerless to do that through the law. It involves the Word of God. It involves His Spirit changing us and enlightening things. So education is tied to morals, but the real foundation for morals is an understanding of who God is and acknowledging Him. Those all three go together. And so as a result of that, I realized law is a ministry of justice. That is full-time ministry. Law isn't just something you do to, it's tent making to support ministry. It is ministry. So that changed my whole orientation for things. And I went back to law, and here I've been ever since.
I think that's fantastic. I really appreciate that. It's a deep insight and something I'm going to be studying a little more in my own spiritual growth. So let's dive into some of what I wanted to discuss with you today. How is government education connected to the idea of establishing a religion?
Well, we've got, the word establishment in the First Amendment. And I'd like to draw a distinction between acknowledge and establish. And there's not a lot of discussion out there in terms of defining religion or establishment. So here's a distinction I will make between the two. Acknowledging is to acknowledge who God is. He's the source of law. He's the source of our life, the source, the creator of the universe, as the Declaration of Independence says. You can't really have a proper legal system, a basis for law, except on authority, the authority of God. Now, acknowledging God is not an establishment of religion. An establishment of religion is setting up some institution, government funded, that is designed to say, this is the truth, and this is what you should believe. Now, that institutional form used to be the church. So there was a close relation between the church and state, sometimes conflict, sometimes the state over the church, and so on. But you had an established church. As that went away to some degree, there was more of an establishment of a media. Now, today we have TV. A few hundred years ago, it was publishing houses. Today, the chief form of establishment is a public school system. So there, the state is funding or itself establishing schools. And then the question is, well, what is religion and how does that play into it? So for the definition, but that's the distinction. The state does have a duty, I do believe, and it's proper to acknowledge God's existence, his source for our laws, but it doesn't have the power to establish the institutions to basically, by force that on people.
Right. So, and I remember you saying in the other interview too, something about the jurisdiction of religion and the jurisdiction of the state. Like those are the two jurisdictions. And can you explain a little bit more about that? How the religion jurisdiction is different from the state jurisdiction?
Sure. This goes back to, I'm working from James Madison and George Mason's definition of religion that they put in the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776 on the eve of the Declaration of Independence. And they defined religion, and Virginia does, it's still there, the duty we owe to God and our manner of discharging it. And that religion cannot be directed by force or violence, but only by reason and conviction. And so in the area of religion, it's governed by conscience. Your conscience doesn't decide what's in the jurisdiction of the state and the jurisdiction of religion, but once it's objectively determined, this is outside the jurisdiction of the state, you're governed by your conscience. Okay. Now, in a sense, all our duties are owed to God, but some of them, the state has the authority to back by force or violence. So basically, in terms of law and the governing of this worldly order, there are some things in the jurisdiction of the state. Everything else is in the jurisdiction of religion. Now, it's important to keep in mind, they're not defining it by some sociological criteria or theologically, but this is a legal document. It's talking jurisdiction. So some things that come within the jurisdiction of religion, we might not typically think of as being religious. And the example I would use with my students is this. Your decision to read Curious George, the Federalist Papers, or the Bible to your children is within the jurisdiction of your conscience. That's a religious decision in terms of religion jurisdictionally in the state. The state has no jurisdiction to use force and violence to force you to read Curious George to your children or to prevent you from reading Curious George. And then answering that question, really, what's in the jurisdiction of the state and what's not in the jurisdiction of the state, i.e. religion, basically, that's a fundamental question for all of jurisprudence or legal philosophy or law. So it's much broader and encompassing than we tend to think of religion as somehow tied to a particular sect or religious cultists in the sense of religious practices of form of worship, evangelizing, and that sort of thing.
So we need to take a short break.
Okay.
But when we come back, I'd like to ask you about ways public schools can promote a specific belief system. So I'll be back with my interview with Jeff Tuomala right after this. A California school district suspended 2 children for 5 days because they quote-unquote misgendered a biological male dressed like a girl by calling him he. A Tennessee student received a 3-day suspension for online satirical memes he posted mocking his principal. A New Hampshire teenager is suing his school district after he was suspended from athletics for saying there are only 2 genders. A North Carolina high school student was suspended for 3 days simply for using the term illegal alien. Schools across the country are limiting students' free speech, teaching them by example that free speech no longer exists in America. U.S. Parents Involved in Education's mission is to empower parents to resist the government school's Orwellian attack on free speech. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education and connect with us at USPI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I am here with my guest and legal scholar, Jeff Tuomala. In what ways do you think public schools promote a specific belief system, even if they claim to be secular?
Well, any education, the philosophers will tell us, and I think they're right in this, um, it's going to have to deal with, in philosophy, three basic questions. One would be metaphysics. What's the nature of reality? And a critical issue there is, where did the earth come from? Was it pre-existing or was it created? So we've got the question of God the creator, or did it somehow evolve from everything? So you have that basic distinction there. Where do we come from? What's the nature of people, humankind, mankind? And they're going to be very, very different answers depending on whether it's a biblical view or whether it's some other view, quite often referred to as secular. Somehow there's a realm of knowledge that's not governed by religion, that's separate from that. So that would be one example. Now, in terms of the creation, the doctrine of creation, it's critical. The Christian apologist Cornelius Van Til points out the unity of knowledge and belief that there's a knowledge that all things hold together, they interrelate, that the universe is not randomness and chance and so on, is really predicated on the Christian doctrine of creation. So the public schools, when they study science, are going to assume there are certain laws there that govern us and so on, but they have no worldview that can account for attribute that. So they're kind of borrowing from Christian capital. Another question usually in philosophy is how do we know? Epistemology. And what will happen with the state, they'll claim, well, we can teach those things that you can know by reason. Religion is just those things over in this other realm that are known by faith. And there's a false bifurcation there, as if Christians, for example, don't use reason. Now, I believe we start from faith and authority, and from that we can reason, but they're taking a very different approach to that. And then lastly, that most obvious in a lot of people's minds is the question of morals or ethics. What's right? What's wrong? What's the source of authority for that? So every educational system that's worth its salt is going to have to deal either expressly or implicitly with a whole host of questions around those 3 points. What I think is most critical here is, what's the source of authority? There's all sorts of things that you could teach in a public school that would be very consistent with the Bible. Don't murder, don't cheat, don't steal. But you may not tell the student, you should not kill, steal, or lie, because Jesus says that's wrong. Okay. You can tell the student not to do that because the teacher says it's wrong. The state says it's wrong, but you can't tell that student, this is right, this is wrong, because God says so. Now, it's interesting, this bifurcation that's made between, I think, secular and religious. It's a false bifurcation. Somehow the world can be divided up that way, to reason, faith, and so on. Historically, secular meant the temporal order. So there's even the temporal priest. The parish priest is the secular priest. He's secular not because he plays cards, dances, and whatever, but because he ministers in the temporal realm. The definition of that word has gotten changed. So somehow that's the realm that God doesn't govern. He governs your personal realm, your personal belief. That's by faith. So there's really a false worldview that's very comprehensive that underlies the whole controversy.
Well, that's very interesting. I really appreciate the way that you explain that, and it is very deep. And I'm hoping that my viewers will watch this and watch it again because that's what I'm going to do because this stuff is so deep, but it's so deep in its roots in the Bible. And for those of us who are Christian, and we do consider our organization a Christian ministry, we all believe that we're called by God to take the stand that we're taking and to educate people about these issues. And so I think it's so important for us to understand these issues that we're tackling in the world from a biblical perspective. So I really appreciate you sharing that. So my next question would be, what did Jefferson and Madison believe about government and education, and how did their views change?
Their basic beliefs come out of what's called the Virginia Establishment Controversy. And in 1785, Patrick Henry looks out over the landscape of Virginia and says there's really been a decline in morals here in the Commonwealth coming out of the Revolutionary War. And part of that he attributed to the fact that the Anglican Church had been disestablished. In order to get the Presbyterians and Baptists onto the cause of the Revolution, they quit taxing them to fund the Anglican Church. And he recognized there's a connection between morals and religion. Well, his solution was, rather than just funding the Anglican Church, let's fund teachers of all Christian religions. And so your tax, you would designate it. Do you want it to go to your Baptist teacher, your Presbyterian, your Anglican, a Catholic, or whatever? And if you don't want it to go to them, basically it'll go to what we'd call today, or I would call the county commissioners, and they would set up a school. So your option is your various religious schools or a public school. So that's what we would call today a voucher system. So we've got the voucher issue back. This was at the heart of the Virginia controversy. Well, Madison looks at this and he says, whoa, this is not good. This is contrary to how we defined religion and religious freedom. So he wrote the Memorial and Remonstrance to defeat Patrick Henry's voucher bill. And he was successful. Others joined on with him on that. But not only did he defeat the voucher bill, Virginia enacted a statute for establishing religious freedom. Jefferson had drafted that statute or a bill for religious freedom in 1778, I believe was the year, and it had kind of laid there dormant. The Virginia legislature adopted that statute that Jefferson had written with a few minor modifications, but that becomes the law in Virginia. And there's two basic principles that are set out that I think are fundamentally important. There's lots of other, it's a document very worth reading, but it starts out, whereas Almighty God has created the mind free. So that's the first principle. God has created the mind free. The state has no jurisdiction over religion. Now, keep in mind, religion isn't defined narrowly, okay, in the terms of sect or religious cultus. And he goes beyond that, and it says to tax a person for the propagation of opinions that they don't believe is, quote, sinful and tyrannical. So not only forcing somebody to go to an established church or school is wrong, it's wrong to tax people for somebody else's church or school. And he even goes on, basically, even for your own church or school, that robs you of the freedom to decide which pastor you want to fund. And it's important that although they're talking about the bill that Henry introduces is to teachers basically of moral or religion, there's not a clear distinction between church and school religion and religion, church, school. And so it's in terms of teaching morals, not in terms of proselytizing or worship service and that sort of thing. It's really educational. And he says the state has no jurisdiction to tell you what to think, even in terms of matters of, he uses physics and geometry, right? Which we tend, oh, well, that's secular, that's not religion based. So it's the freedom of the mind, not just for some little narrow Sunday worship. It's for all things.
Why do you think the Supreme Court has not clearly defined religion as it pertains to the First Amendment?
It's hard to explain and to understand, and I'm not sure that I do. In law, let's say we take criminal law, and you've got an exam question, and it looks like a burglary question. And you know that burglary is breaking and entering the house, the dwelling house of another in the nighttime with an intent to commit a felony therein. You've got to define those terms. What's a dwelling place? What's the nighttime? If you told your professor, I don't know, and it would be dangerous for me to answer those questions, you'd get an F. So here we have the term religion in the First Amendment, and the court really hasn't defined it. Now, part of the reason I think is the cases they take on that deal with the religion clauses, usually it's those things that, oh yeah, that involves prayer in school, that involves Bible reading. Everybody agrees that's religion. The problem is, without defining it, they basically are blind to the question, is education really in the jurisdiction of the state, or is that religion? It's interesting. Usually the religion clauses are at the end of the textbook, covered at the end of a course. But earlier on, there's a framework for doing legal analysis in most types of cases. It comes out of a case, McCullough v. Maryland. And in that, Chief Justice Marshall says, let the end be legitimate, let it, and within the scope of the Constitution. Okay. So you have to ask, is this a legitimate government interest or purpose? And I asked the students, can you think of anything the government does or might do that's not legitimate? And usually there's not an immediate response. So I suggest, what about this? Is it legitimate for the government to tell us what to think and what to value? Oh, no. Okay. And then I ask him, so public schools are not legitimate? And so I put that in there, but that's a question that's fundamental for any constitutional issue. Is this a legitimate government interest? And I'd say the government has no legitimate interest in telling you what to think or setting up institutions. Of course, they have to tell us what the laws are, and they can give us a justification for laws. They communicate that way. It's incidental to their functions of doing justice, but not setting up institutions, establishing this is what everybody should think and this is what they should believe.
Which is exactly what we have.
Exactly what we have.
That's exactly what we have. And unfortunately, they're not even telling them to think the truth. So and I love how you referenced our rights and what rights are, because, that's an argument I give often for parental rights is, we don't need a law establishing parental rights because we have God-given rights. And as soon as the government gets involved with establishing what a parent's rights are, they can also say what they aren't and govern that. So I think that's so valuable for us to understand that our rights absolutely come from God, and everything should be framed around that.
And the way I would deal with this with students, I'd say, who has jurisdiction over children? The state, the church, or the family? And most students would say, well, the family, but there would be some hesitancy there. for the most part, for education, I would say certainly the family. But if a family member is seriously abusing a child, the state has jurisdiction for the purpose of protecting against certain harms. And the church has jurisdiction in terms of who's to receive the sacraments and so on. But basically, yes, parents have a duty to God to raise their children in the fear and admonition of the Lord.
Yes, and so that's a good point because that's another issue we deal with, especially with the woke agenda, is the fact that, their rationale for not telling parents that their children are transitioning to a sex opposite their biological sex is because they need to protect them. So we deal with that a lot in the issues that we talk about. So I'm glad that you highlighted that. And I might point out too that, when a parent is harming a child, then there's a crime involved. And so that's when the state has jurisdiction because there's actually a crime taking place.
Yeah.
So we need to take a short break. I'll be back with my interview with Jeff Tuomala right after this. A Michigan high school recently approved an expressly pro-Hamas position for a student debate while turning down the option to present a pro-Israel perspective, in effect endorsing arguments in defense of an international terrorist group. A New York City elementary school engaged in Jewish erasure when a classroom map of the Middle East identified all countries except Israel, which was labeled Palestine. Incidents like these illustrate how the indoctrination of impressionable minds leads to anarchy, evidenced by an increase in anti-Semitic activity on college campuses by students who have been radicalized. U.S. Parents Involved in Education believes that the next generation must be rescued by restoring education to its local roots, controlled by parents. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education and connect with us at USPI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I am here with my guest and legal scholar, Jeff Tuomala. Jeff, from a Christian perspective, why should the government stay out of funding education altogether?
There's two basic answers to that. The first one, and that's has been my focus more, is a principled basis. Is that within the jurisdiction of the state? The second area is more what I would call the prudential issues. Is this a good idea for the state to do this? Does it really work? And we see lots of evidence that it doesn't work. And partly that's because there's a breakdown of morals, and there's a breakdown of morals because there's not an acknowledgement of God and where the source of knowledge and standards of right and wrong come from. And looking at some of the various studies that have gone on in terms of drop in academic performance, complaints about the behavior of students in schools, it really does start from the 1960s. And I don't think it's just because religion is taken out of the schools, although I believe that's a huge part of that. A lot of people don't probably remember the big school consolidation movement of the late 50s and 60s, where lots of local neighborhood community schools get consolidated, supposedly for the purpose of offering more opportunities and probably wider range of courses to be taken. But it really takes education further away from the parents and their involvement and oversight of that. So you see a decrease in performance, you see a decrease in the moral standards and behavior. So you've got both going on. But if the state has no authority to do something, it makes sense that God is not going to bless that and that it's not going to work. Now, anybody that has children has faced this question. Okay. You think you know what's right and wrong and how you ought to raise your children. If things aren't working out the way you hoped and expected, It may be just because they're little sinners, but it may be, yourself as a sinner, and maybe I'm not doing things right. So there's a constant assessment that's going on back and forth there. So I don't think we necessarily know, okay, this is right or this is wrong because it's working or doesn't seem to be working at this moment. So there's got to be a rootedness in principle and an understanding of what's right and wrong. If we do what's right, honesty is the best policy. If you do what's right, you tell the truth. That's the first step in good policy decisions. So we've got a similar interplay that's going on. Now the state has basically said, in a way, we won't look to religious authorities to have schools, and they shouldn't, but they shouldn't be establishing the schools to make those kind of decisions and selections. And so if things aren't working out well, people should be asking, maybe we've got it wrong. Maybe we're going about this wrong. And hopefully that would spark some thoughtfulness along that line. And I think it has. People are looking at it and you see all these different solutions, vouchers, charter schools, maybe funding homeschool, all sorts of things that are going on. And those things might seem to help in some ways, but long term, if the state has no jurisdiction over those matters, they're going to be prone to failure. And also, the state is not going to be putting out that money if they're not going to be directing how it's used and funded. So that control is going to be there, and it's going to come back and undermine the parents.
Which again is exactly what we see happening today. In fact, it's on steroids today. It's a matter of control and even driving a wedge between parents and their children. And I'm trying to think, it wasn't Horace Mann, but one of the early influencers in education said that would be the goal of education, is to separate children from the values of their family. And this has been such a great discussion. I hate to even end it, but I know we both have limits on our time today. But before we end, I want to ask you two questions that I ask all my guests.
Okay.
So the first one is, what are some of the things you're optimistic about? And the other one is, what are some of your concerns?
I'm very optimistic, looking back over the last 40 years of seeing how the homeschool movement and the Christian school movement have flourished and continue to. And there's no identifiable, here's the leader that started all of this. I think it's the work of God's Spirit working in people. That's what has given kind of the unity of purpose and direction to all of it. So nothing could be more encouraging than that. Another is, I was at a conference I spoke at last fall, Christian Education Initiatives, and hearing the various speakers, parents and people in other organizations, that the kind of creativity that they had come up with for teaching, for helping parents at a very high level. Once, there's that, when they talk about American spirit as being innovative and creative, and seeing that would be going on. So that's incredible. Those are, I just find incredibly encouraging. And increasingly, I think people realize, we've got to have a worldview that sustains this. Looking at this is not an isolated problem. That's what's encouraging. The things that are discouraging too, or that I'm concerned about. One is, we've already talked about, there's a recognition the court has said we treat religion and non-religion neutrally, and the state has that duty. There's no way they do. They don't even come close to that, right? There's an increasing realization. There's a couple cases before the Supreme Court this term. They're going to be argued in April. And I think people are realizing, and I think the court is realizing, we're not treating religion and non-religion equally. There's been some cases in the last decade that they've really headed towards a neutral treatment. But if that means vouchers and charter schools, that's problematic. So I'm worried about the government's control over things that way. The other is, and this is a practical question that's often asked, and it's a very important one, and that's who's going to educate American children if the state doesn't? Well, one response is they haven't been doing a very good job of that in those schools and areas that people profess the most concerned about, underdeveloped center city, rural areas, and things of that nature. So the question is, how are we going to teach those other than just our own children? It's in part, it's an evangelization, in part, it's a proper Christian charity way of teaching. So are Christians going to, are they going to forfeit their season tickets to go watch the Dallas Cowboys and go to Disney World again and whatever else? There's probably some things I should forfeit to fund education in schools. The opportunity is tremendous in terms of a Christian renewal in this country if people are willing to make the sacrifices and think innovatively. Those are my concerns.
This has just been such a great conversation, Jeff. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. I'm so grateful that you are working in this realm and especially teaching young people this whole perspective on the law and how it relates to our faith. I think that's awesome. I wish that my children could be one of your students. I'll just have to pass along the podcast, I guess. Thank you for listening and supporting our work. Join me again next week for another episode of Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, U.S. PI seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional U.S. PI chapter in your area, please visit uspi.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapter section.